Hello, everybody. Good morning. Just kidding. So I want to talk to you today about pride and identity and the intersection of those two things. And I'm going to start by telling a story from my own life. Growing up, athletics was a big part of my life. Some of you may know. Played a lot of baseball, beginning from when I was 5 to throughout high school. And it really was my life. I was on the school teams, I was on the Little League, I was on the All-Star team, the travel team. In high school, I actually got a scholarship to play at a private Christian high school, and if I played on the baseball team, they would comp me a portion of my tuition. So, needless to say, it was very much, I had wrapped my identity up in baseball. And I would always practice. Like if there wasn't a game on, I would be outside with the neighborhood guys, throwing the ball around. And when there wasn't anybody to play ball with, I would be throwing my baseball against the back wall and outside and catching it and practicing my grounders. And it was just something that I really devoted my life to. And one day, for whatever reason, I was inside and I wanted to practice some baseball. It was maybe raining or something. So what I did was I would throw this ball against the couch, like the bottom of the couch, so it didn't like hit a wall or anything. And my dad was in the room, and I was really talking myself up. I was probably being so annoying, but I would throw the ball against the couch, and I would go down, and I would get it, and I would pretend to fake like the throw, because you want to get the mechanics and the footwork down. And I was maybe 10 or 11. And my dad's probably, reading a book or he's watching TV, and I'm not supposed to be playing ball in the house. And I'm talking like I'm the announcer, like, oh, and Fitzsimmons picks it up at shortstop, and he throws over to first, and he gets the out. And I was just being like a really annoying kid, as a 10 or 11-year-old, most 10 or 11-year-olds are. And so my dad, in his wisdom that I've known him for, he says, Dan, and he paraphrases that proverb, and he goes, pride comes before a fall. I'm like, all right, Dad, whatever, And wouldn't you know it, the very next time that I throw the ball against the couch and go to field it, I trip over the coffee table or a chair or something, and I just sprawl on my butt right in front of my dad. And I'm there, I'm like spread eagle, and I'm just looking at him, and he's just laughing at me. And I was laughing too, because it was funny. And pride does come before a fall, but it was a funny anecdote, and we told it to my mom later. We all had a good laugh about it. And there wasn't too many consequences with that little mini lesson there. It was more humorous than it was effective in my life. But I would come to find out what having your pride damaged means in a more real way. I was in 8th grade, and I was at the school that I told you about, this private Christian school. It's called Chapel Field, and we had this scholarship thing lined up. And in 7th grade, I'd gone there from 6th and 7th grade. I went there from 6th to 10th grade, but this part of the story, I was in 7th grade, and I was on JV, which, for any of you who know high school sports, that's a little unusual. But I was good at baseball, right? So in 8th grade, I went up to varsity. That JV season, I had a good season. We won a lot of games, and I was feeling good about myself. And then in 8th grade, they brought me up to varsity, and that's really unusual. Even though we were in a lower division competitively, it's unusual for an 8th grader to be on varsity. And I felt good about this. I was telling my JV friends that, I got promoted to varsity. I was telling my Little League friends, like, look what I'm doing. And I was pretty small back then, and I didn't realize what I was getting myself into. And the beginning of the season happened, and I just wasn't getting playing time. Probably my best attribute when I would play, when I would get up to bat, is I was so short at that time that the pitcher had trouble finding the strike zone. And so that was probably my best attribute, that I was short, ironically, and I was able to get on base that way. But all in all, I had a bad experience my first varsity year. And I can remember it crystallized at this one point. We were inside. It was maybe a third of the way or halfway through the season, and it was raining or something. So whenever that would happen, we would go into the gym, and we would have different drill stations. So I was in the gym, and I was hitting a ball off a tee, as one does, and my coach was trying to explain this hitting concept to me, and I just wasn't understanding it. I wasn't getting it. And he would explain it, he would demonstrate it, I would go to do it, and I would just get it wrong. And he turned to me at one point, and he said, Dan, I really wish that we had kept you down on JV. And I don't think he meant it to be so harsh, but that gutted me. that like really, really hurt me. I still remember it to this day. And it happened, when I was in 8th grade. I cried in the locker room later. I told my mom about it. Like, I don't think he was trying to be mean about it. He was probably criticizing more of himself. Like, for your development, we probably should have kept you down on JV. But if you're getting that as a 13-year-old boy, you're going to take that a little differently. So Mama didn't raise no quitter. I stayed on the team and didn't have a great year. But the year after that and the year after that, I had better years. And eventually I transferred to the high school, to the public high school, Pine Bush High School, where I grew up. But I feel like from that day on, baseball and there was a little bit of a parting of ways. Whereas before I would approach the game with joy and it was just so much fun for me. Now there was an anxiety element to it. If I did poorly, I would analyze myself. I would criticize myself. And my team won, but I had a bad game. I had trouble rejoicing with my teammates because I didn't get the hit or I flubbed the foul ball. And the problem with that is that my identity, as a kid, I made my identity baseball. And it was what I did. It was what I was good at. But I had a pride about it that in reality wasn't justified. I was good at baseball, but in the beginning, not at the varsity level. So my pride was founded on nothing. What did I really bring to the team? And when I had that realization, it wasn't that I wasn't good enough. It was that I had lied to myself. I had let myself be deceived. Like, how could this happen? Like, do I not even know my own self? I'm me. How do I not know that, hey, I'm on this bigger team now. There's these guys that are twice my size. I'm going to have an issue here. There was pride there. I was blinded by pride. So thinking about all this stuff, I'm reminded of that record in Matthew 16 where Jesus is explaining to his disciples what will happen to him. It's Matthew 16, verse 21. I'll give you a little time to get there. He says, "From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chiefs and priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, 'Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you.' But he turned to Peter and he said, 'Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man.'" I want to read that last little part again. "For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." This is one of the strongest rebukes that I know of in the New Testament. It was probably shocking to Peter. Peter had devoted his life to Christ's ministry. He had forsaken all that his life was before he had met Christ. And here's this guy basically calling him Satan. Like, that must have been a shock to Peter's system. But Jesus wasn't wrong. Peter was thinking like a Gentile. Peter was perhaps thinking that Jesus would elevate the Jews by force and would overthrow their Roman oppressors and would usher in a new golden age for the Israelites, right? And there's a corollary. Jesus again rebukes his disciples, and Peter in particular, in verse 30, Matthew 26, verse 33. This is before this. Jesus is explaining that his disciples are going to abandon him, and Peter says in verse 33, Matthew 26, 33, Peter answered him, "Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away." Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all the disciples said the same. Peter proclaims that he will die fighting for Jesus. Is that a prideful statement? Peter had pride in that moment. He did. "I will die for you, even if all the others forsake you. I am the best apostle. It is I, Jesus. Even if all the others abandon you, it is I who will stand and fight for you." And Jesus says to him, "Peter, before the night is through, before the cock crows 3 times, you're going to deny me." And he says, "Never, never." And we all know what happens. In later on in the chapter, in verse 56, it says that all the disciples left him and fled. In verse 75, Peter had denied knowing him 3 times. This is after Jesus' arrest and his sham trial, and then he was tortured and mocked. And people started to look at him and say, hey, you knew Jesus. You were out there with him preaching. And Peter said no. And then another person came up, and Peter said no. And then finally another person comes up, and he says, no, I didn't know. I tell you. And then the rooster crows. And it says in Matthew 26, verse 75, and Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. So in keeping with the analogy, this would be the point where I had realized that I wasn't as good as I thought I was. That all of the boasting that I did, all of the prideful statements I had made to my friends, certainly not the emotional gravity of this record here, but that's where this story intersects with Peter. That's where my story intersects with Peter in this example. But thankfully for Peter and for us, that's not the end of the story for him. Jesus rose from the dead. He appeared to his disciples. He gave them the Great Commission, right, in Matthew 28, to go out and preach to all nations. And then Jesus ascended, and then in Acts 2, we read about the apostles getting the Holy Spirit, the helper that Jesus said he would send. And then in Acts 4, we see Peter and John. Acts 3, actually, we see Peter and John. They healed the lame beggar, right? And everybody's amazed. And Peter says, why are you amazed? And he starts preaching the gospel, and he starts talking about Jewish history, and everyone is like, whoa, blown away. This is a whole new Peter, right? I mean, there's pride there, but isn't it a better kind of pride? Isn't it a good pride? Where's his identity now? His identity is in Christ. His identity is in what he saw after Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension, and after receiving the Holy Spirit. This is a whole new Peter. He wasn't wrapped up in being the best apostle or the conventional thinking of men using his own wisdom that Jesus is going to overthrow the Roman government. His identity and pride were aligned with Jesus' teachings, which enabled him to do what he did in Acts 4, and what he would continue to do throughout his ministry of spreading the gospel, to speak with authority and boldness and truth. And so in Acts 4, we read that the Pharisees and Sadducees, the Jewish religious leaders who had basically just put Jesus to death a few days before, they don't like what he's saying, right? They don't like what he's preaching, so they shut him down. And we can turn to Acts 4 real quick. It says, and as they were speaking to the people, as Peter and John were speaking to the people, the priests and the captain of the temple and the Sadducees came upon them, greatly annoyed because they were teaching the people and proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection from the dead. And they arrested them and put them in custody until the next day, for it was already evening. But many of those who had heard the word believed, and the number of the men came to about 5,000. I just love the difference that you see in Peter between, at the end of Matthew, I think the last person that associates him with Jesus is a little girl. He goes from shouting at a little girl that he didn't know Jesus to being before the very people that were instrumental in putting Jesus to death and saying, preaching the gospel. And the rest of the chapter, the Pharisees are saying, we better not see you out here preaching again. And Peter says to them, whether it be right in the sight of God or men, like you be the judge, but we can't but to preach. We can't but to speak. This is such a 180-degree turn because Peter had a life-changing moment where he changed his whole identity, and he changed what he put pride in. He stopped putting pride in himself, and he put pride in his gospel, in the gospel of Christ. I still have fun playing baseball and watching baseball. I'm on a softball team every year, and it's fun for me, but it's no longer my identity, If I flub a fly ball, I'm not thinking about it the next day. It's not keeping me up at night, And that's because I'm not a baseball player. I'm a son of God. So I encourage you to think about in your own lives, where your pride is, where your identity is, the things that occupy your time, what you worry about. And the identity that I want to aspire to and that I want to strive to is towards being a son of God and towards someone that can spread the gospel. And I want my focus to be on that and not on my own old man thinking of I know what's right, I know what's best. God knows what's right and God knows what's best. And then just to close real quick, I want to go to Psalm 103. And in verse 14, Psalm 103:14 says, "As a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. For he knows our frame, he remembers that we are dust." We don't know ourselves as well as God knows ourselves. It says in Psalm 139 that he formed our inward parts, that he knew us when we were in the womb. God knows us a lot better than we know ourselves, and he knows what we need to place our identity in to lead fruitful, fulfilling lives. Thank you.